Great, and welcome. You can go ahead and take the show away.
Terrific. I do not see who's in the audience. Oh, there. If I click on attendees, that gives us, okay, wonderful. So hello, everyone. Really happy to be with you today. This is a fabulous opportunity. We're just thrilled to be able to share with you a bit about Atlantic Black Box and how you can become involved. I'm going to share my screen. And so before introducing you to our activities, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. I'm wondering if any of you here feels comfortable answering any of these questions about slavery in Maine. When it began, when it ended, how many people were enslaved in your town, in the state as a whole, what forms of work they might have been forced to do, and what the experience of enslavement was like here. Who were some of the enslaved people in your town? And how did your town vote, for example, in the 1860 election? Since I can't hear or see you, feel free to drop answers in the chat if you have any. We don't have time to get into a lengthy history today, but I will just note that if you struggled to answer any of those questions, you are not alone. What I'm showing you right now is the body of Liberties, which was established in 1641 in Massachusetts, which of course at the time included the now state of Maine. And I just want to underscore that this document, while it establishes those critical democratic ideals that we have come to consider as being, as representing, you know, the values that we hold dear, both in this region and in our country today, by the very same stroke of a pen, slavery was made legal. Massachusetts was the first colony to legalize slavery. And when you ask the question, like, why is it that we don't know this, that we don't teach it, that we don't discuss it? I just want to draw your attention to this map that was created by a scholar, Lincoln Mullen, not long ago. It's actually a wonderful interactive animation which shows the spread of US slavery throughout the colonies and territories over the centuries. But what do you notice about Maine? It comes out white, right? And Massachusetts as well. And this creates the impression that no slavery ever existed here. How about these questions? Maine in the slave trade. When did people from Maine begin participating in the slave trade? For how long were they involved? How many Maine-built vessels were implicated in the slave trade? How many captive Africans did those vessels carry to the Americas? Please, if anyone has any notion of an answer, please feel free to drop it in the chat. I took this data from slavevoyages.org, which I encourage everyone to go check out. It is the most comprehensive database that we have available to us, a wonderful collaborative project involving multiple universities and scholars and independent researchers around the world. And what one finds when culling the data is that out of New England, there are 1,740 known slaving voyages. And it's important to stress that these are the known voyages. It's only the tip of the iceberg, and these were transatlantic. I haven't included all of the domestic slave trading that our vessels were involved in. But below you can see, just for the state of Massachusetts, which again during the period that this data covers, Maine would have been part of Massachusetts. Tip of the iceberg. This is our colleague Kate McMahon, who couldn't be here today, but it is her scholarship that, has, meeting Kate was sort of the point of activation for me with Atlantic Black Box. And she's a critical member of our crew. And what she has uncovered in doing her own research is that just between the years 1855 and 1865, which is to say the eve of the Civil War, right up through the Civil War, Maine vessels were heavily involved in the illicit slave trade. Massachusetts vessels were as well. Atlantic Black Box has a great deal in common with the Black Lives Matter movement. As a coalition, we too are committed to organizing collective action in service of racial justice and equity. And we too are looking to forcibly bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice through coordinated collective action. But whereas much of the anti-racist organizing that's happening today is designed to push for changes to current policies, as rightly it should, such as defunding the police and abolishing the prison industrial complex, et cetera, Atlantic Black Box has identified an adjacent site of critical intervention in the struggle for racial justice, and that is history. We are mobilizing a grassroots historical recovery movement powered by citizen historians and guided by a broad coalition of scholars, community leaders, descendants, educators, archivists, museum professionals, anti-racism activists, and artists. We are, in short, crowdsourcing history. You've all no doubt heard of citizen scientists, those folks who go out and count butterflies in the towns where they are, and they send that critical data back to scientists in their laboratories and offices, which allows the scientists to create a big picture of massive trends to explain what is happening. Well, we are asking communities throughout New England to pick up a shovel and dig at the micro-local level to engage in a collective project of historical recovery. And recovery is really the key word here. We believe that we cannot collectively recover from the racism that has plagued our society and continues to reproduce age-old inequities until we have collectively worked to uncover New England's deeply repressed racial history. So many hands participated in burying the evidence of our region's complicity in the business of slavery and sweeping it under the rug. We believe it is going to take that many hands to uncover it and begin the long process of reckoning. Why interrogate the past, you might ask, when there's so much that urgently needs our attention in the present? It's really a valid question, and I hope we'll have time to discuss it more in depth later, but just to quote James Baldwin, if you don't know what happened behind you, you've no idea what's happening around you. That is to say, if we are not proactively working to correct the historical record and tell a more inclusive story, we are perpetuating historical harm. Here in New England, we don't have Confederate statues to remind us of our racist past. And I would submit that's something of a handicap on our journey towards historical recovery, because the invisibility of our complicity has meant that we've been operating for centuries on a false notion of what happened behind us, as Baldwin says. We have been passing down stories that are not based in fact, but rather in fantasies about bracing adventures on the high seas, about righteous communities founded on democratic principles, about hardworking, upright citizens who earned every penny they made. And yet, we have somehow been ignoring a staggering pile of evidence that would contradict these stories and that fly in the face of our region's dominant narrative in which a staunchly abolitionist North serves as a heroic foil to the slave-holding, racist, backward South. To be sure, ignorance about the history of the place now known as the United States is epidemic. But ironically, it's here in the Northeast, right here, where people take such tremendous pride in our history and are deeply invested in preserving and promoting our maritime heritage. It's here that we are arguably the most deluded about what happened on this land, about who lived in our communities, about what profits from exactly what sorts of commerce went into constructing the built environment that we take such care to preserve, or where all those merchant seamen were actually sailing to, and how this region fits into the global economy during what we nostalgically refer to as the age of sail. Simply put, New England is deeply alienated from its history. Now, I realize that this is a bold statement, but historians working in this emerging field of scholarship will state with certainty that we have not been researching the most important things there are to know about New England, and that is the region's extensive and longstanding investment in what we refer to as the Atlantic world slave economy, or the global economy of enslavement. And by these terms, we mean participation by Northern shipbuilders, seamen, merchants, and bankers in the transatlantic and domestic slave trade, the enslavement of indigenous and African-descended peoples throughout the Northeast, the exploitation of enslaved labor through what was euphemistically referred to as the provisioning trade in connection with the brutal coffee and sugar plantations in the West Indies and in South America, where captives who survived the Middle Passage from Africa had only a 7-year life expectancy. I started thinking about black boxes back in 2017 when I sensed that our society was in a free fall. In the event of a tragic crash, it's these small devices designed to record critical flight data that allow investigators to reconstruct the events leading up to the accident. They're built to be nearly indestructible, and we might think of the black box as an archive. Recovering the black box, then, is a form of historical recovery. Knowing what happened helps to bring closure to grieving families, but for many, comfort only comes with knowing that a concerted effort is being made to prevent such tragedies from happening again. And that is the true purpose of the black box. It's a device that records history in the interest of progressing towards a better future. And that is our model at Atlantic Black Box. We recover the past to help us recover our humanity in the present. This is a 19th century black box. What do you notice about it? It's empty. And this is a really fitting metaphor for the state of the archive in New England when it comes to our maritime trade. So many documents are missing. There are gaping holes in the record. The archive is deeply fragmented and it's biased. Why is it empty? Well, scholars will tell us that countless customs records went up in flames, both in the terrible fire of 1872 in Boston and right here in Portland in 1866. But definitely not all losses can be attributed to mere accident. Deliberate sabotage was absolutely a factor. However, not everything burned. And all it takes is a bit of curiosity for you to discover right here under your feet that there is evidence of New England's complicity in the slave economy all around us. It is inscribed in stone in our cemeteries. It's in our vital records, in our newspapers and wills and probate records. But we have to be ready to see it, and we have to be willing to dig for it. Some say that what you don't know can't hurt you, but what we don't know about New England's past, it does hurt us. It hurts all of us. It's just that it hurts some of us more than others. And now I want to pass the mic off to my friend and colleague, Dustin Ward.
Well, thank you, Menno. I appreciate the great introduction, and I wanted to answer the question for everybody: the why. Why is this work that Menno's been talking about so valuable? What we've heard about is a black box. Now, why is such a black box important in this day and age? Well, it does archive history. But when we talk about the contemporary black box that Menno described, it's important in those tragic crashes. It's an archive that shows the history of where a plane and what a plane did. And once it is opened, it is used to hopefully make future changes so that the elimination of that tragedy is the end result, so that that tragedy can never happen again. It's that history that Menno's talking about that now changes the future of a flight. And so we have had a tragic crash this year. You see, over the years, we have seen and we have heard the names of Black brothers and sisters who've either been killed or murdered or lynched or hung or jailed. We've seen discrimination and hatred because of the color of one's skin. And it's all from this undercurrent of race, racism, and the embedded history of enslavement. And then 2020 happened. And there was an eruption of a conversation, and there was a tragedy before our eyes. We globally saw Mr. George Floyd murdered. We collectively rose up. We wanted to understand more. We wanted to see that history and say, why are we still at this juncture? Why is racism still a reality? And it started to make us question all of our previous work, all of our discussions, all of the protests, all of the conversations, all of the policies. Did it really make any difference? And we realized we needed to look at the history to change our future so that a tragedy like Mr. George Floyd never happens again. That's the focus. And so history actually shapes our present reality. It shapes those answers to the questions of identity. And I always like to bring in my personal story here because I grew up in Maine. I'm from Presque Isle. I'm part of the public school system. I was a grad of Presque Isle High School, and I had a great education. There's nothing wrong with it. But as a BIPOC member, as a Black man, I never learned the history of Maine, let alone the intertwined history of enslavement that Maine has had. I was surrounded by a predominantly white community, and I always had that question, well, who am I? Right? I searched for the answer to that narrative. How did I fit in a society that didn't look anything like me? And I'll never forget, I always tell my colleagues here about that first time in 5th grade, my first association with my own identity. I asked a history teacher, we were learning about civil rights, and I said, teacher, what fountain would I drink from? And she said, the black one. She said, because any individual with one drop of African blood was going to be someone who was considered Black or considered a Negro at that time. And for me, that was one of my first affirmations. Okay, I'm Black. I'm what is considered a Negro in that time. But then in that same year, I heard my first racial slur. I had a student who called me Blackie. And it was at that moment, I realized that color made me different. And my color, my skin color, was used as an attack. I was sort of other. I was not the same as all of my white friends. And so then the questions of, okay, where does my history come from? What is that history? What does it look like? And how can I answer some of these questions of my own self-identity? Now, throughout my public time, my public education time, I continued to hear some of those racist comments, those stereotypes. Heard it in middle school, heard it in high school. Those are jokes, all comments based on my skin color. But they also got layered with misunderstandings of what it really meant to be a Black individual. This misassociation of who Black individuals were. I became susceptible to so much racial bigotry, to stereotyping, and I sort of became a novelty to white individuals, both in the public education system and even in churches and in other places that I would go. So it all culminated, and it all amounted to this realization that I never felt like I belonged. I was really too dark for white people, but in the same sense, I still also felt too light for Black people. I always felt I wasn't equal to those around me. They all seemed better than me. And so I was left with an emotional aspect that I couldn't process. I felt alone in it. And what I needed was the history of my people. I needed to know that I belonged here in Maine, that my history and my roots run through somewhere, that I wasn't an anomaly. And folks, that's why this work is so important. That's why knowing our history is so important. Because one, there's a danger of a singular lens. If everything is understood in such a white context, this misshapes what is normal or what the norm is. It throws the natural order of things out of whack. But by unearthing Maine's history and the association that Black and brown people have, even in New England, it would have helped those around me, those who didn't look like me, to appreciate who I was, to not stereotype me, and to see me as a valued part of even American history. Even though it is ugly and it is hard to stomach, people would have recognized that indeed I'm included in this world, especially here in Maine. When we think about the importance of this history, it helps to show empathy for BIPOC individuals, that we can finally find a space to fit in, and it shows a level of care that we're willing to take under our wings and curate the citizen history, right? To go from learning, you can go to empathizing. You can personalize it. You can begin to solidify that we are part of the very purpose and the very reality of this state and this country. And it also helps to define where we live, where I live. You see, history is not just oral. Oral is geographical, right? So learning that local history, and what you'll hear is it's called place-based education. It can create a sense of connection to a place that I had called home for almost 18 years before I moved to Southern Maine. But to create that sense of connection and to lessen that feeling of being a novelty, of being an outcast in a place that I so often was at, that's the value of knowing this history. And then when we can see the state and the towns and the cities and the places we go and how they're intertwined with the full context of history, we can then identify our own story. You see, if I'd have found my roots within that history, that they run deep in a mostly white state, I would have had such more of an appreciation and an association with both Presque Isle and with Maine and even New England. And thus it would have finalized this belonging. Right? If we can learn our history, even at critical years and at a critical junction, we can sense that belonging, and it begins to be established. And then I wouldn't know I was alone, that I had a place in this history. Even though it is difficult to stomach, I knew I was there. I could point to it. And so, folks, that's why Atlantic Black Box and many of our colleagues, that's why we do this work. One, we want to unearth this history to create that belonging. We want others to feel that as well. So we teach and we explain so that BIPOC members have this connection. They can be part of that land that they have so forever called home, but have felt lost in. To learn that Black history is, yes, American history. And that instills a sense of pride that really has been knocked down for so many years. To know that we belong, to know that I belong, oh, that's powerful. And that's an empowering feeling to take with you as you grow. But even more important, which we've actually learned myself over the last few weeks, is as we look to engage in diversity, equity, inclusion conversations, and as many folks have begun that work in their locale, in their organizations, we need to know how deep and embedded these issues go. And a current example I have, even as of this last week, I'm doing work with Waldo County. And there are good, wonderful individuals who are doing this personal work of trying to reconcile with what don't they know and what they need to know about Black history. And as we are confronting these issues and talking about them, and as they want to really do good work and have a new future, I've begun to work on Black history education. And we recently learned even the name of Waldo County, is reflected by a slave owner, Samuel Waldo. Samuel Waldo got his wealth from enslavement and from inheritance. And so here we are. Here's a group of us wanting to do the good work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and to realize that this runs so deep, even into the names, and even into the very foundation. And so thanks to Atlantic Black Box, we've brought that to light. And now it can allow white individuals to really, who want to do good work, to know the full extent of how embedded this racism really goes, that we're not just talking on the top of the surface, that this is truly deep within our history. And now we can think forwardly, we can move forward, we can think about our future actions and about the future legacy we want to impart and leave. And so, folks, history matters. What we do here matters. One, it's going to orient us to today's problems, seeing where they have stemmed from, seeing how we are still at this point, and seeing how people have been seen as others for so long. It's not from a miseducation, it's just from missed education. To explain why BIPOC members are still hurting and still in pain, and we still feel that sense of loss. That's what this history allows us to reconcile with. It also brings a sense of empathy to those who are hurting. We're reminded of this tragedy, and it helps redirect the understanding of humanity, as Meadow has said. It's really about re-looking at one another in a humanistic perspective. This history matters because it helps us not reinterpret history. And we avoid creating new myths and new truths from a one-sided history. No, we get the full context of that history, and we can stop that lie. Baldwin was quoted here, and he has talked much about the lie that we have been told and how we can reinterpret and redefine that as real truth. This history matters because it reminds us of hallowed ground. Folks, we stand on very hallowed ground, that our cities, our towns, and our places of worship, they should be appreciated and honored because they're part of an interwoven history. So when you walk by those places, when you drive through those towns, when you're parking, when you're walking, when you're taking a hike, you can always recall the truth and the history that you've learned. And out of this history, we will humanize one another. History helps us humanize, and it builds that bridge back towards that humanity. And so finally, we can reconcile our present and we can move forward because it reminds us of how far we have gone, how far we have to come, the many ills we've had, and how this whitewashed history can really be expanded, that we can grapple with it and we can reconcile our true identity. We can move forward and we can know where we come from. We can make choices for a better future. We can avoid that dehumanizing language. We can stop seeing one another as other, and we can bring inclusivity. We can bring that belonging. And that's where empowerment comes. This history helps empower us, especially those who have been marginalized for so long. That's why we do this work. And that's why we continue to do this work. And we wake up every morning loving that we do this work. You ask any of us, this is a blessing for us to do this. And so we are excited to continue and move that empowerment forward. And so that's just to give you a bit of a context of why we do this and why this is important. But I want to hand it over to Vanna as well, who can give you an even more of another facet to why this work happens.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dustin. I'm Vanna Carmona. I live in Portland, Maine, and I am an independent researcher. And as part of Atlantic Black Box, I am what we refer to as a citizen historian, and I am helping as the director of Maine community research. I am an excellent example, an excellent white version of what Dustin was just describing. I was on the other side of the history, and I was on the side that essentially wrote it in the first place. I am obviously a white woman. I grew up here in Maine. I've descended from a number of the area's founding fathers from the 18th century. Got the great education, the great schools, master's degree in history, lived in other cultures, you name it. But so why did I not know the truth about my own history? That is the question. So, and what was even more shocking in my case is that I actually grew up in a situation which was a little bit more racially diverse than most people in Maine. I also had very liberal parents who were following intently the civil rights movement of the 1960s and working to change their own mentalities. And I've been aware of the biases of written histories. I know that the winners write them. And I've always been skeptical, and I've always attempted to see things from the other side. But yet, when it came to African American history, right here on my own doorstep, I was, dumber than dirt. I was as ignorant as the next person. And there really wasn't any excuse for that. But I always asked myself, why? Why did that happen? And for one, it was never taught. How was I supposed to know something? It's the same thing. If you don't know it. How do you know it? It was just it was never taught because somehow we, the dominant white race, didn't feel that it affected us, obviously. At best, we could look at history, African American history, very academically from a very detached perspective. It was always fascinating, isn't it interesting? But we were not really affected by it. But one day, literally, that changed. And that was going on almost 8 years ago when I was out in a cemetery where many of my many ancestors are buried. And I ran across the grave of a person that some of my family had enslaved. So suddenly it was my history. And I also, with my family, was complicit. And that was definitely a shock. So what did I do? Well, at first I had to get over my anger. I felt very mad at my family. I mean, they'd all been dead for a long time, all the family genealogists and the family historians. Uh, I I discovered that they did indeed. I found evidence that they did know about this and they didn't talk about it, not even among ourselves. Okay, that was their generation, that was the culture at the time, but there was still a sense of betrayal. Um, but I got over that and I became obsessed. I wanted to know everything I could about this man in particular, and in doing so, learned that there were several others. I found at least 6 and possibly 7 people who were enslaved by that same extended family. And then for me, things started to escalate and I began making lists and the list grew. And I now have a database of over 1,800 people people of color who were alive here in Maine prior to the 19th century. I've called it the Prince Project because Prince was the man that I found in the cemetery. And and then I realized after I got a little way into this project that I was actually in a very unique position. I was learning a lot and I felt this urgency to use that knowledge and share it, that we all needed to make this our collective history. But I came up against a wall. That proved a lot more difficult than I had expected. People did not want to hear it. I remember a few years ago, before George Floyd and the Black Lives movement, that's when this took place. And since then, thank goodness that things have changed a lot, and I've witnessed that firsthand. What I see now is more awareness of the inaccuracies of our standardized white history. We may not know the full truth because we haven't been taught, but we are more open to it and trying to learn. But I was very stunned at people's reaction and even more surprised that their reactions were pretty universal. First of all, I would hear, we didn't have slaves here, not at all. Total denial. And of course, that's absolutely not true. We did have slaves, plenty of them, all up and down the coast and also moving inland as history proceeded. And I've also been told, oh, you don't understand. Those weren't enslaved people. They were servants or indentured servants. Well, they certainly weren't paid laborers. I can guarantee you that. Well, that wasn't true either. Black people didn't come to Maine from Africa because this was the land of opportunity. And people were not kidnapped in Africa and forced onto those horrific ships to come here to be servants with time limits. And where would be the profit in that? Now, just to be accurate, it was back in the 17th century, enslavement was slightly different, and some people were brought here. It was easier to negotiate possibly with your enslaver for term limits or maybe to buy your own freedom eventually. They did originally have a few more rights. They could testify in courts, etc. But that all changed in the early 18th century when we saw this sudden escalation of the trade and the true chattel model emerged. A lot of people point to the word servant. They say, well, look, it says servant. Well, yes, but servant is a word that's very misleading. And we can't cling to that as evidence that these people were not truly enslaved. The term servant was actually used in both the North and the South for enslaved people. And then there were those people, many universally again, who did accept that we had enslaved people in Maine, but that our slavery was different and it wasn't like the South. And I've never been sure quite what that was supposed to mean. A lot of people say we were gentler and kinder, but I have found examples time and time again that wasn't true. Numerous cases of tortured and murdered enslaved people left to die in the snow because they couldn't find the cows, hauled off to be sold at auctions. Yes, auctions in Maine for minor infractions. Children stripped out of their parents' arms and sold. So I don't know what's gentler and kinder about that. And no slavery is gentler and kinder. You still can't live your life as you wish. You can't marry whom you choose. You can't keep your kids. You can't get educated. You can't vote. So what difference does it make? You can call it gentler and kinder. I don't understand that personally. I also encountered resistance to my early attempts to help change the narrative and to re-educate people about our true history. I offered to give a tour once. I'm a volunteer docent guide for several organizations, focusing on the prominent early families and the people they enslaved. And that made people very, very nervous. You know, should we do that? You know, this is a difficult subject, the quote unquote difficult. And as my fellow colleagues know, difficult history is the term that I sort of dislike personally. It's not difficult, it's ours. So I found that it's sort of odd that we recognize the ugliness of history elsewhere, but not our own. We learn about wars and genocide, the Romans, the Mongols, the Hitlers, but when it comes to our own history, we like to stay focused on just how great we've been. We fought for our freedom, the great democracy, look at our founding fathers. We even have organizations, most of which were developed in the 1890s, who revel in being descendants of these founding fathers and these enslavers. So we try to downplay anything that contradicts that, and we recoil when somebody questions it. And do note, we're not alone in this. I know that several years ago I was in Portugal and I tried to talk about their slave trade, and nobody knew anything about it because they'd never been taught. So, you know, it's kind of like join the crowd. And I also learned. So where are we now? I think it's sad that so much time has had to pass. It's taken centuries to even get to this point. It's great that we can now discuss it. I'm glad that we can reach out and share what we've learned over the past few years and that people actually want to hear it. And that is a really huge step. Education, I believe that's what we need to do. And I can certainly consider it my calling in spite of its frustrations. We do need to rewrite the narrative, make more people aware, and hopefully get more people to think and act and have more people out there working to uncover this history, more citizen historians. About a year and a half ago, I was fortunate enough to meet Meadow, who had just started Atlantic Black Box. And she too had shared her own similar revelations about the enslavement in New England. I'm very pleased to be an active member of this. It's what we need. The objective is to reach out, coordinate research, database, inspire more local historians, and change this narrative once and for all. So I'm handing this over now to Seth Goldstein, who is an education coordinator at Atlantic Black Box, and he is also an instructor of history at Mecca.
Thank you, Vana. So for those of you who may not know, Mecca is the Maine College of Art where I teach not art, but history. And as Vana said, I am the educational coordinator for the Atlantic Black Box. And my pleasure to work with Meadow, who Meadow and I grew up together on Cape Cod, and we shared a school bus stop. So I'd like to share some information with you this afternoon about some of our educational initiatives at Atlantic Black Box. And so I'm just sharing my screen. And I can't see anybody, so if somebody would just say that they can see my screen, that would be awesome.
Seth.
Thank you so much, Meadow. So Atlantic Black Box educational initiatives. So Dustin mentioned earlier place-based learning. And so this is when we learn about a physical place. And one of the ways that we do this at Atlantic Black Box is through guided tours. But some of the advantages of place-based learning as opposed to classroom learning, one of the things it does is it connects to our core mission of making these repressed histories accessible to everyone. And as Dustin was saying, it allows individuals to reinterpret the urban landscape through the lens of new and evolving historical research regarding New England's complicity in Atlantic world slavery. And also, as Dustin was saying, it provides a sense of place for people from the BIPOC community. And for me, as an educator, to share the knowledge that I've gained over the last few years, particularly with people BIPOC heritage, is the most fulfilling part of what I do. I remember one individual, Black woman who grew up in Portland, who did a walking tour with me this past fall. And at the end of the tour, she said to me, "Seth, I didn't know any of this. I have friends who have moved away from Portland because they feel like this city doesn't have anything to offer them, or that they don't have a connection with this city. Through your tour, I've seen that there have been a history of people just like me who created this city and who are an intimate part of the history of the city of Portland." So here you can see guided tours. This was an advertisement for a tour that I did in January. Some of the topics that we discuss through these tours are the Wabanaki Indigenous Americans who lived here before European colonization, which you also discuss. I discussed the virgin soil epidemics that very unfortunately killed large numbers of these Indigenous Americans. I discussed the connection between Indigenous slavery and African slavery, which is a very fascinating topic that a lot of people are not aware of. We talk about enslavement here in the greater Portland area, as well as resistance. We discuss African American or people from the African diaspora who are mariners or who are involved in related maritime trades on land, like dock workers or coopers or sailmakers. I discussed the Underground Railroad and the African diaspora community within Portland. And right now we're in the process of developing a trio of guided tours with our partners, Indigo Art Alliance. One of their founders, local artist Daniel Minter, created the plaque that is on the granite markers that compose the Freedom Trail in Portland. They were put in place in 2007. There was initially 13 of them. Today there are 16 of these granite markers that detail the experience of individuals from the African diaspora here in Portland. So as I said, we're developing a suite of guided tours for school groups and young people. So the 3 tours are a People's Tour of Portland, which discusses African American or history of people from the African diaspora, as well as Indigenous history, immigrant history, for example, Irish, Italian, Jewish, Eastern European, and women's history as well. Then another tour that'll be specific to Portland's African diaspora. And then finally, a third tour that would be focusing on Portland and its connection to the Atlantic world slave economy. One of our goals is to train young people, particularly young people from the BIPOC community, to conduct these tours for school groups. And so we will be training young people to do that in the near future. And we're also developing with our partners at Indigo Art Alliance a companion website and an interactive map to support these guided tours. So I also have been doing virtual guided tours. The physical tours go over pretty well in the summer, but not so great in the winter. And so this winter, I turned the physical tour into a virtual tour, and I presented this virtual tour for the first time at the Maine College of Arts for their Resilience Week, and I've presented it several times subsequently. So this is just to give you an idea of what that tour looks like. The tour starts here on the Portland waterfront, where I discuss slavery in Portland and we talk about merchants from the 1700s and the slaves that they owned, both here in Portland and in South Portland, where I happen to live. We walk along the Portland waterfront to the site of Fort Loyal, which was the site of a battle in 1690 between the French and Wabanaki. And they were fighting against the English, who had ensconced themselves in this fort, which was at the foot of modern-day India Street. This is a great opportunity to discuss the genocidal treatment that the Wabanaki endured from the English colonists, and to discuss many of the cultural misunderstandings that led to what was in fact 80 years of protracted warfare between the Wabanaki and their French allies and the English here in Maine. From there, we walk a little bit further down the Portland waterfront and we come to the site of J.B. Brown's sugar refinery, which was the largest building on the Portland waterfront in the 1800s. I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. From there, we walk up Exchange Street, where we stop at one of the Freedom Trail markers. This is the site of Lloyd Scott's secondhand clothing store, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment as well. From there, we go just up the street here to the site of Reuben Ruby's hack stand. And for those of you who don't know, a hack was simply a horse-drawn carriage. You can kind of think of it as a horse-drawn taxi. And Reuben Ruby, considered by many historians to be the most prominent forefather of Portland's African diaspora community, donates the money and the land where the Abyssinian church would be built in 1828. And from there, we go to Lincoln Park, which was the site of the Quaker Meeting House, where there were abolition meetings in the 1830s and 1840s. And we finish up at the Abyssinian Meeting House, which is the United States' third oldest African-American church. It was built in 1828, today on the National Register of Historic Places. And so here is on Exchange Street, Lloyd Scott's secondhand clothing store, and there's a Freedom Trail marker out front. And it discusses how the secondhand clothing store was essential to the Underground Railroad. Now, if you were a self-emancipating enslaved person, particularly following the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it would behoove you to change your appearance. If you were recognized and you were captured, you would be returned to slavery in the American South. But if you could make it from Portland to Canada, then you could be free for the rest of your life. And so these secondhand clothing stores were very important to the activities of the Underground Railroad. So you could change your appearance. Also, a lot of people from the African diaspora go into the business of being barbers, and so that they could, once again, help you change your appearance with a haircut. And many of these barber shops had wigs and fake beards. Once again, if you were recognized, slavery in the American South, freedom in Canada. And so this is not part of the Freedom Trail, but a site that I've incorporated into the tour. And this is the site of the tallest building on the Portland waterfront and the largest building in the 1860s, J.B. Brown's sugar refinery. And so you can see here it states that Portland imported 3 times as much molasses as Boston during this period in the mid-1800s. About this time, 1860, 20% of all of the molasses in the U.S. is processed in Portland more than any other city in the United States. And so why is this of interest? Well, the sugar and the molasses are coming from Cuba, and that's our #1 trading partner. And Cuba at this time is basically a giant sugar plantation where enslaved Africans produce all the labor. At the beginning of the discussion, Meadow mentioned how the life expectancy of an enslaved African in Cuba was 7 years. So they're sending sugar and molasses up here. Some of that is refined into rum at the 7 rum distilleries that dot the waterfront of Portland. Some of that rum shipped to the west coast of Africa as a trade good to buy more enslaved Africans. And Maine is shipping to the West Indies, particularly Cuba, lumber, salt cod, all sorts of agricultural produce, building materials, and casks. So there's this very robust trade between Portland and the West Indies, and in particular, Portland and Cuba. Here's a little bit of press that we got following the virtual tour that I did for Mecca. This was the Portland Press Herald's forecaster. Journalist wrote a great article about the virtual tour that I did, and Meadow introduced me and talked about our program a little bit. And here we have some testimonials from educators. Meadow, myself, Kate, Dustin, Vana, some of our other colleagues. This past year, we've gone virtually to several different educational institutions to present our research. This is a couple of interns that worked with us last spring from Chevers High School. And so you can see very glowing testimonial here. And this was from a program that Meadow and I did a couple months ago for the entire 9th grade class at Casco Bay High School. And we got some great feedback here from Matthew Bernstein, who was a social studies teacher. And I just love that many of the students expressed that hearing from Seth and Meadow helped them better understand where they live today, and they unearthed histories about their home that they had never known. And to hear that, for me, is just fulfilling in the utmost. So couldn't be more pleased because this is what we intend to do. And so we are, at least to some degree, being successful. We also presented some information for what's known as Parent University. These are parents of students in the Portland Public School System. We did a 2-part presentation, which included Dr. Kate McMahon presenting her research on Maine and the Atlantic slave trade, Dustin and his research on Dustin and his experience, not research, but direct experience on the significance of regional BIPOC history and what that history means to people of color. Our colleague Linda Ash Ford, who's a longtime educator here in Maine, discussed common misconceptions regarding New England's complicity in Atlantic world African enslavement. And finally, I presented Portland's role in the Atlantic world slave economy and the city's role as a hub in the Underground Railroad. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And at this point, we would like to open the floor to questions.
And maybe I'll ask the first question. Susan, is there any way for the attendees to actually speak to us, or do they have to put their questions in the chat, in the Q&A?
I believe the chat or the Q&A would be the best approach to do so.
I did have one question that I saw in the chat earlier. This was from Randy Hogan. She's researching, or they're researching money that started the Episcopal Church in Portland around 1765 in Portland. And so I was wondering if, Vana, maybe in your capacity as local researcher, is this a period that you're familiar with? Oh no, we lost Vana at just the wrong time. How inopportune.
And let's see. Yeah, so we would love for everyone to throw questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I might just take this opportunity while you're doing that to mention a couple of the other types of projects that we're working on with Atlantic Black Box. Seth mentioned our partnership with Indigo Arts Alliance. This is something that we're really thrilled about. We have a project called Remapping New England, where MAP, in addition to literally sort of suggesting that we need to redraw our maps of this region, it evokes memory, art, and place. And so this collaboration with Indigo really is looking to bring together the history and the arts as a means of sort of creatively interpreting this history. And So we've got currently a number of things going on and in the works. A speaker series, which is monthly. So we just last month, we featured author Skip Finley from Martha's Vineyard, who presented his book, Whaling Captains of New England, of Color, Whaling Captains of Color, rather. And this month, we're featuring Dr. Christy Clark Pujara from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who will be presenting her book, Dark Work, The Business of Slavery in Rhode Island. And I want to explain sort of the design of our series. It's sort of like the expression, you can give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, or you could teach a man, let's not be sexist, you could teach a person to fish and they'll eat for a lifetime. That's the basic concept behind our speaker series in conjunction with our research forum for Atlantic Black Box members. So the speaker series, we give you a fish. Look, here's somebody who has dedicated essentially their lives to studying this topic, which is related to New England's history of complicity in the slave trade, global economy of enslavement, or Black history in New England. So that person has the opportunity to share their findings, but then we ask that scholar or independent researcher to return a couple days later to our Atlantic Black Box Research Forum. And this is where you get the instructions on how to fish, right? So the scholar comes back and explains how they conducted their research, what sources they consulted, research methods, difficulties that they encountered along the way, how they overcame them. And we are, when we talk about crowdsourcing history, we're also, very much community sourcing knowledge. So we are developing from this series of sessions, we're pulling gems from the research forum, and we're building a live shared document that is essentially a community guidebook to how to perform this research at the local level, and everyone can contribute to it. So if you have interest in the speaker series, you are welcome to come. They're free of charge. You can also make a donation to Remap at New England. And we would love for you to join us on a regular monthly basis. We have some amazing people lined up. If you're interested in doing the research, please join us, become a member of Atlantic Black Box, join our research forum. There are many benefits to membership, including, very importantly, I think, networking. Seth, Dustin, Vanna, all of us, I think, would agree that, finding one another and being able to make these connections and enlighten one another. Say, hey, what do you make of this? I found that what do you think of this term servant? Do you know anything? Could that mean slave? Could it be a euphemism? Like getting together, sharing resources, sharing knowledge, processing things, just having additional sets of eyes, because so many mistakes, frankly, have been made in the historical record simply because there was one authority sort of, in charge of interpreting data. So I'm going to stop there. Do either of you see questions coming in?
Yeah, we do have a question, and it's from Bryce. Can you recommend sources for Maine-based ship owners and captains who transported slaves elsewhere, even if they did not come to Maine? And I think that's Kate's research in kind of in a nutshell. Many of very few slaves were transported to Maine, but there were numerous ships that were built in Maine and captained by Maine captains and crewed by Maine crew members that would have departed, some from Maine, many from New York. New York was the hub of the illicit slave trade following 1808. But they would have brought the slaves from the west coast of Africa to Brazil or Cuba, most likely. And then perhaps some of those enslaved individuals would have been transshipped to the American South. We do know that there were a fair number of slave owners in New England, and that some of those slaves, particularly in the colonial period, did make their way to New England and Maine. And if Kate were here, she could provide so much more information on this topic. But I suffice to say that there were hundreds of Maine-built ships, crewed by New Englanders, Mainers. In fact, point of interest, the only individual ever fully punished for what was deemed a piratical act. The slave trade was deemed a piratical act in 1820, punishable by death. But the only individual who's ever fully punished is a gentleman by the name of Nathaniel Gordon, and he hails from Portland, Maine. He's hung in New York City in, I believe, 1862. Now, he's not the only individual who's ever caught with a ship full of enslaved Africans off the west coast of Africa. He's just the only individual who's ever fully prosecuted. Many others escape. They bribe their jailers. They have rich friends or lawyers, and they escape justice. But because this is during the Civil War, Captain Nathaniel Gordon is eventually hung in New York City in 1862. So I would encourage you, Bryce, if you wanted to know more about this, and I was remiss in not mentioning our website, which has a incredible amount of resources, books, links to videos, links to articles. You can see Meadows put it in the chat right here. And so if you're interested in any of the topics that we've discussed today, or if you just want to know more about the Atlantic Black Box, we have, Meadow has put together an incredible website with just like so many resources, and great resources for individual scholars, for educators. I would strongly recommend, if this interests you, then please check out our website.
Yeah, and I'll just mention too that Kate McMahon has a book in the works that we're all very much looking forward to. So there, hopefully before too long, we will all be able to get a more in-depth view into Maine's role in the illicit slave trade. However, Kate has been extraordinarily active on the speaking circuit, particularly over the past year. And there are many videos, some on our website, some at the Maine Historical Society site, where she's given, I believe, 2 talks at least in the past few months, and elsewhere that you certainly can find in the meantime. Do we have any more questions, guys? I see someone's asking whether the history tours will be available this summer. What do you say to that, Seth?
Well, absolutely, it'll be available this summer. Right now, we are in the work of developing a designated web page to be affiliated with the Atlantic Black Box, where you can go and register for the walking tours. And so I've conducted about a dozen of this tour, what we're calling a People's History of the Old Port. And so I started last summer. I actually did a tour up until January. That was kind of an adventure. And I've started doing tours again just the last couple weeks. And so we're just working with our web designer, and we hope to have that up and functional in the next couple weeks here. In the meantime, if you'd like to take a tour, you can reach out to us at the Atlantic Black Box before we get that designated page up and running. And we have a list going of people who are interested in doing tours, and we can plug you into one of our upcoming tours.
I might mention a couple other projects that we have in the works, unless someone sees another question. Or Dustin, do you want to jump in?
No, go ahead. That was actually one of the questions is, if you could eke out 2 hours more in a day and had 26 hours, what are some initiatives you'd take or do?
Oh my goodness, there is no end to what needs to be done. And we have, I think, collectively a lot of great ideas and goodwill. We've actually been running, I may as well mention, entirely on a volunteer basis. Our fundamental crowdsourcing model, it honestly has it has a lot to do with the way in which this history got written in the first place, right? We love our historians. We love the scholars that we work with, and we work really well with them. But I tease them a bit because I say, we really cannot leave history to the historians. If history has taught us anything, it's that we can't leave history to the historians. We all need to be involved actively in doing history, not just learning it, but doing it. Because I've come to think of it, and I'm a convert. I was a literature person, so I used to think that that I had the luxury of just reading fiction. And I tell you, since my brutal awakening, also thanks to a headstone in our hometown of Brewster in 2016, I have not read any fiction, aside from maybe one or two novels that my 12-year-old has insisted I read. So the importance of informing ourselves with all of this wonderful, recent scholarship that's been, produced in the last decade, that's a huge task, right? Complicity. But beyond that, we all need to actually get busy uncovering this history. It's all around us, and it's really going to take all of us. So in the same way, our model relies on the goodwill of citizen researchers, because, when racial justice activists say white people need to do the work, we believe that this is one really effective way to get busy doing racial justice work. Because what you learn in the process of actively doing history, it's transformative. When you realize that this is history that you've got a deep personal connection to it, either through your ancestry or through the house that you're living in or through the ground that you're walking on, it engages you in a way that nothing else can. And so we ask of interested people, we ask of everybody, frankly, whether you're interested or not, we say, give your most precious resources. That's not your money. It's your time, your interests, sustained interest, your energy. That is what we're asking above all else. And so my friends here and I, and our larger crew, we've been doing like 99% of this work on a volunteer basis. Of course, we need funds to actually make this sustainable long term. But your memberships, this is a coalition that we're building. So one really great way to support this project right now is to just become a member, join us, show your interest. Like I said, there are many benefits to it.
Hey, Meadow, I was just thinking about, some of our partners throughout New England, and would you share with the audience some of the projects that we're involved with? Like, I'm thinking like the Venture Smith Project, which is, definitely crosses over into the realm of education, but I think it's a great example of some of this, the networking that we're doing and how we're partnering with different people throughout the region.
Totally. So, also inherent in our approach is, you could say, connection. Okay, connecting the dots, which is the actual title of the project that Seth is referring to. Connecting the dots of the transatlantic slave trade through the life of one individual, Venture Smith. What we're doing is we're connecting classrooms throughout the Atlantic world in a collective place-based project. So whether you are an independent school in Connecticut, a public school in Rhode Island, an international school in Accra, Ghana, a public school in Barbados, what we're doing is we're offering a common platform and a hub where we can all come together and give students the opportunity to do real project-based learning and say, okay, how is this history of slavery, how did it happen here? And is it represented in the environment? You know, can we see it? Can we read it in the built environment? Is it acknowledged? But by retracing the itinerary of Venture Smith, who was taken in Ghana, in the inland regions, marched 1,000 miles perhaps down to the coast, put on a vessel, a slaving vessel from Rhode Island, who managed to survive a horrific Middle Passage where smallpox took out at least 1/3 of the captives, was not sold into slavery in Barbados like the majority of others were. He was brought back to Rhode Island and enslaved in numerous households between Rhode Island, Long Island, Fisher's Island, and Connecticut, Stonington, East Haddam, etc., until this man managed to buy his own freedom, that of his wife, that of his sons, and that of some other African American or African descended peoples in the area. And he became a fairly prosperous landowner, and he left a memoir. So what we're doing is offering students the opportunity to study this incredible man's life, an exemplar of resistance and agency under the most trying of circumstances, but also to tell us and one another in an authentic learning experience, how where they are connects to this much larger history. So that's a really exciting project that we're working on with some fabulous partners. And if we had a lot more time, I'd tell you about some of the other works that we've got going on. But really, just if you come to our website, atlanticblackbox.com, and hit Get Connected, that one's not membership, right? That's just, hey, I want to hear about what you've got going on, and we'll keep you informed. Guys, do you have any closing remarks?
I don't.
Well, I will close out by saying thank you so much, Atlantic Black Box team. This was a fabulous presentation. I learned so much, and I'm really excited to go on a tour. So I'm really pleased that those are happening this summer. I also just want to thank you, Seth, Dustin, Meadow, and Vana, who I tried to get her back in here, but we didn't have much success. So for sharing today and just being part of this conversation and making it available to everyone. I put in the chat.
Oops, Susan, we can't hear you. I can't hear you anyway.
Go. Okay, I guess I got cut out. Thank you again. Please fill out the survey. And in closing, I invite everybody to head off to our keynote next. Megan Ming Francis will be speaking in about 15 minutes. So another exciting presentation. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming, for your attention and your interest. And thank you, Susan. This is really fabulous. Thanks, guys.